This is a partnership between African Voices Forum based in Bristol, XRISN, and XR Bristol. As a friend mentioned earlier, we're hosting this series during African Liberation Awareness Month, which takes place during the month of May. And it's a month that is commemorated on a global scale as an opportunity to tackle African targeting racism, which is also known as Afrophobia. And we do this by celebrating Pan-African resistance, knowledge, and culture in a system that for centuries has denied African humanity. It's a system that has violently displaced hundreds of millions of African people from their ancestral homeland, and still today robs countless of Africans from their true heritage. In last week's panel, many of you probably watched it, both for watching this live stream now. We focused on the global Black experience of ecocide, and we explored how the Pan-African movement, which is like the struggle for unity amongst both like African peoples here in the diaspora, but also in the motherland and the continent. And we explored how this is linked with the climate crisis and how they're almost like one and the same fight. Today, we will sort of continue this conversation, but we will narrow the focus, because as the climate and ecological crisis unfolds, posing, one of the like greatest risks to all life on Earth that we have ever known, we believe it is groupings, of indigenous peoples, like the Pan-African movement, and other communities of resistance who must be in the lead for the fight for planet repairs. And within these communities, we recognize that both like women and youth play also a very important role to bring about transformation. And it is to promote this that the next two discussions of our online mini-series will focus. And this particular discussion is going to focus on the role of the youth. Our hopes and aims with this session is to begin to explore and discuss how that vibrance and that energy of youth, that energy of like change that runs really in the veins of young people can come to the fore in this most drastic of times. So we're here today to give space to young African voices who have been actively involved in their communities to bring about youth-led change, to learn and hear from their experiences, from their personal experiences. Steph is a student at Queen Mary University in London, and she's also one of the coordinators for XR Youth Solidarity here in the UK, but she's been really active in various student movements, including students Stand Up to Racism. She's organized loads of occupations to demand change in university policies. Then we've got Amy. Amy, if you can wave at the camera for us. Hey, Amy. Amy is a 15-year-old activist. She's based in Cape Town in South Africa, and she's been actively involved in a group called African Climate Alliance, which is a youth-led affinity group that's focused on delivering dynamic and afro-centric environmental action. Then we've got Juwon. He's a young activist and he's a journalist. He's based in Nigeria, and he's the head of the TakeitBack student movement, which is focused on rallying students against anti-student policies. And he's also part of he's the youth lead of the Coalition for Revolution movement back in Nigeria. Then we've got Dom. Dom is based in Bristol. He's a sports science student, and he's the youth executive for the Ghanaian Association here in Bristol. And then our fifth panelist, last but not least, we have Kofi. Kofi is based in London, and he's a long lifetime Pan-Africanist activist and community advocate, and he's also one of the coordinators for XRISN. A big part of Kofi's work has focused in providing mentoring and support for young people, especially young African youth, in various young projects to bring about Pan-African community regeneration. We have invited here Kofi today, as it is customary within African culture to look up to previous generations for guidance, as we recognize that the struggle for planet repairs and for the unification of like African and African peoples is not a new struggle. And it is a struggle that for generations, people like yourself, Kofi, and many other generations before, and in the Pan-African movement have been waging for a very long time. And it is on the shoulders that, you know, the generations of today stand on. So Kofi's not here to like tell these young people like what to do, but rather to share experiences. And this panel is for us to share all of our experiences in a process of mutual learning, and hopefully we can learn from each other. We believe like the young are faced with a very unique challenge, and you know that is like continuing the legacy of their elders, but to do so in their very own unique way. And I really like this quote by Frantz Fanon, which is like, out of relative obscurity, each generation must discover its mission, fulfill it, or betray it.
I like to bring out examples of response of young people here in Nigeria, you know, even to the ongoing pandemic. We all know that in a bid to contain the spread of the virus, governments across the world have been declaring lockdowns. And quite fortunately, it is equally not, quite unfortunately, sorry, it's not also different from what's happening here in Nigeria. So only that it took more monstrous and thoughtless direction. You know, the government here in Nigeria, for instance, imposed a lockdown, and the lockdown was imposed under a very ridiculous atmosphere. There was no single social relief, no single social relief, in order to ensure that people find it easy to comply with such lockdowns. So that was the situation we found ourselves. But nonetheless, people went on lockdown. And mind you, Nigeria is such a country that has very high rate of unemployment. And when I talk about unemployment, young people are most affected by the menace of unemployment. So that most young people who could not find job take more solace in daily jobs. So there are more people who do daily jobs in Nigeria than people who actually have real jobs. You know, I mean corporate jobs or jobs. So with such lockdown, young people were most affected. The lockdown that wasn't accompanied with social relief, or albeit you can put it as palliatives. So due to this, there is this saying that goes to us that an idle hand is the devil's workshop. So the lack of jobs amidst young people, complemented by unprecedented hunger, descended communities into chaos. That is, younger people, also not younger, other young people terrorizing the entire community. You know, young people who are reacting to unemployment and hunger, even lack of access to basic amenities in the midst of a lockdown. We're going from communities to terrorize people, extracting money, stealing, miming. It went, in fact, it was so terrible that even the security was overwhelmed. So, but it took, also within that community, it took conscious initiative of young people in those communities. One of it is my own community, for instance. It took the initiative of young people to also come out. It was one of the most funny, why it was good response. So it appeared kind of funny, you know. Young people also within communities were coming up with sticks, bottles, and axes to chase out other bandits who are also young people. So eventually you discover that it was also the young people within the communities who rose, you know, against rising crime rates, which was complemented by some the effects of the lockdown. But No sooner than a lot of young people, including myself, also realized that there is a need to engage the Nigerian government, on the grounds of, for instance, you can't, even prisoners, when you imprison people, when a judge of, or when a federal high judge court, sentences you even to death. When you're on a death row, you will be given food. You won't be starved to death. You understand? So let alone when the Nigerian government decided to imprison Nigerian people in their homes, under the guise of containing the spread of a virus. What is only normal is that they should also provide them with food, meals. Those were the grounds. Then the organization which I belong to, the Revolutionary Movement, which is majorly composed of at least 95% of members of the Revolutionary Movement are young people. In fact, the movement is predominantly young people, with very few over 50s within the organization. So we took a conscious initiative that such that in the situation where we couldn't go to the streets to protest due to lockdowns, we took to the social media. And mind you, long before now, I think about sometimes last year, we had the Nigerian government who had been terrified about the strength the social media was guarding. And this how young people in Nigeria were beginning to utilize the social media to challenge some policies. So they had plans to shut down the social media. So there was a senator who sponsored a bill. There was a senator who sponsored the bill to the National Assembly, demanding a death sentence for what they categorize as hate speech. That is, the implication now is that if you criticize government on the social media, you get the government could term it as hate speech. Hence, the implication is death sentence, death by hanging. Meanwhile, corrupt politicians are not being given dished out with punishment of death by hanging. But people who want to critique government will be handed death by hanging. That was a major issue, that the Nigerian young people also had to use the same social media the government wanted to shut down. The government used it to challenge the government. So this was a struggle with which we were at the forefront of the movement. And eventually, so fast forward to now, this same social media happens to be a major instrument young people are now relying on. You can imagine if we had not fought against government attempt to criminalize free speech on the social media, we wouldn't have had the opportunity to lead a protest on the social media against lockdowns that was not accompanied with social relief. So our protest, I think the protest that's about some 3 weeks ago, Alejandra, you're part of the protest. The Hexal youth also really helped mobilize for solidarity. So here in Nigeria, we launched a protest called the Pot and Pans protest, where young people were directed. We had to coordinate young people on the social media to come in, to stand in front of their respective houses, bring out their pots and pans, and started beating it, demanding that the government should give them food, that they are hungry. So this protest was for about a week. Yeah, we had a week-long protest tag pot and pans protest. Now, despite the history of recalcitrance and uncouth adamance on the part of the Nigerian government, they had no choice other than to listen to the voice of young people who were protesting on the social media, that you can't force us into an option of death by hunger or death by coronavirus. So the government, of course, they had no choice. They listened. Then, rather than doing what is necessary, they took the easy way out, which I bet is still a concession anyway. They eased the lockdown so that people can now go back to their jobs to make money under some supervised conditions. So this was how young people made a difference. Fast forward back to even what happened some periods of between last year, I think 2018, thereabout, we right before the climate strike by young people, you know, the global climate strike that we are all familiar about, professors, a lot of them who are old people, had been, you know, masturbating around how climate change is terrible. Professors had spent more than 10 million words in describing how terrible ecocide is. But none of them actually are taking bold steps. Not even the International Labour Organization, with better resources, greater experiences. You know, but it took young people lesser in their young people in high school, a lot of them probably less than teenager or even in their teenage years. You know, did a climate strike, the kind of climate strike that mobilized millions of young people across the world. You know, that was quite unprecedented. So this once again re-emphasized how young people can shape the line of history. And even coming back to my home country again, Nigeria, you see, Nigeria for years was under the rule of the military. That's under military dictatorship between I think between 1966 and 1999. Although there were democratic interregnum anyway, there are periods where, you know, there were chances for election. But then the democracy wouldn't last for about 3 years. The military would take over all over again. So we had a democratic interregnum. But generally speaking, the military didn't live until 1999 in Nigeria. So, but it was young people, particularly students, you know, the student movement, who organized themselves against military dictatorship in Nigeria. And it is to the students we owe the advent of democracy in Nigeria in 1999. So the role of youth in in fighting any kind of struggle, including climate change, cannot be overemphasized. In fact, as a student union leader in my university, I could remember there was a period where a vice chancellor was going to be imposed on members of staffs. So the members of staff could not reject that draconian policy. It fell on some of us who were student union leaders at the time, and mind you, the situation was quite more challenging for me, because I was just returning from suspension from the university. Prior to that time, I was suspended from the university for leading protests against fee increments. So eventually, I returned to the university under an atmosphere where staff unions were intimidated by the shenanigan of members of the governing council. The governing council were more or less like the higher administrative body in Nigerian universities. So they were to impose. They had an election for the vice chancellor, who was supposed to head the university of my university, and they held it under very terrible conditions. They rigged the election in a university. It is understandable that rigging election in the country is different. Probably Nigeria, they rig election a lot of time in Nigeria, but one would have expected more sanity in a university. So quite unfortunately, they rigged an election in a university, the election for the vice chancellor. So it fell on some of us who were student leaders at the time to reject it and stand against the imposition of vice chancellor on the university. I was suspended the second time for that action, but nonetheless, we never relented until the government dissolved the governing council of the university and directed the Senate, the Senate, which is a lower chamber to the governing council, to appoint an acting vice chancellor. It was not until they appointed an acting vice chancellor, the acting vice chancellor then pronounced our reinstatement back to the university. So these were some of situations where young people had made differences. Young people like myself, where more adult individuals were intimidated, and it's all thanks to that young people have energy, and others appear to have very little to lose. Because for the adults, for the adult, they do have a lot of things they think about. You're thinking about your children, you're thinking about school fees, you're thinking about your husband, thinking about your wife. But I don't have any fucking wife to think about.
I was just going to say, youth have great power in today's society. We are the generation who will vote next and who will be taxpayers and hopefully even lawmakers. So many movements around the world are youth-led, and this should apply to the fight for climate justice. We have so much passion and so much courage, and I strongly believe we can change the system. We just need to stand up and make our voices heard. Youth have played and continue to play a vital role in spreading awareness about political affairs. For example, in South Africa in 1976, there was a protest called the Soweto Uprising, which was a student-led protest against the apartheid's regime education policies. And this was an incredibly powerful movement, and it helped to change history, which is and it contributed majorly to why South Africa is out of apartheid. And yeah, I just believe that it's the youth's responsibility to influence the government into taking action through policy changes, and then be persistent in holding them accountable, because the government often promises things and they don't necessarily follow through. So it is our responsibility to literally be incredibly persistent in holding them accountable so that those laws are made. Youth also bring new and unique perspectives to the table as well, some of which adults might not have, or older generation people might not have thought of before. And in that way, we contribute majorly to decisions being made and can definitely help and play a major role in leading the fight for climate repairs.
Juwon, I just think that it's an amazing example, like what Coord, his organisation, managed to do with the force of the young people driving it. And I think I'm in the UK, within Europe, we have seen young people standing up a bit more. It's very difficult because I think Juwon touched on it when he said, we don't have anything that we don't have any ties like family, house, car, etc., things that can be used to, especially used to kind of hold us accountable and make corruption, that cycle of corruption, continue as well. That's a part of it. But also I think, the young people, just this, I don't know how true this is, but I personally feel like it's our duty to kind of take the baton from older people who've been doing this fight for a lot longer, because just the level of institutional racism there is that we've not had to deal with for so long. Of course, we've still faced some of the pressures, but for example, like second generation, third generation people living in the diaspora communities and stuff, we do experience a different type of discrimination, but it's not, I don't know how to phrase it in a way that my parents, for example, just thinking about the level of racism that they had to face and just how much that's wounded them, and feeling like they can speak up and they can play a part in these struggles that are going on, and that their communities have engaged with, but they may not have. And because of just this good immigrant mentality that you feel like you have to keep your head down and not say anything. And I think I'm a university student, and students have actually got a lot of rights in the global north when it comes to protesting, and for example, even the fact that I've been able to occupy a building twice and occupy university buildings twice, and I'm not arrested, whereas if my parents even attempted that when they came to this country, that would be a whole totally different story. And I think there is that we've got to consider, especially young diaspora communities, that they also have that role to play in terms of bringing the resistance groups that are in the motherland to the attention of the wider climate movement here in the West. I think that's very much part of why we have to get involved in that, and why you know, I think it's amazing that we have people calling out, you know, like Extinction Rebellion failings in the past, but, you know, it doesn't just stop there. You have to kind of get involved, because I know that people can kind of, we've got this very much cancel culture where we just decide, okay, no, this movement is like inherently racist, so we're not going to join that movement. No, the system's inherently racist, so you've got to, you know, speak to people. I think struggle is really where you have those discussions with people, and you have that chance to kind of connect with young people, and then you decide, okay, we actually, our struggles intersect, and we can actually try to make a difference about this. And then that is some of the most powerful stuff that I've seen.
Like obviously, just like Steph, I live in the UK as well, and given the present circumstance and people around me, and also the environment that we are from, the youth of today, we have so much power, not just individually, but like as a collective. And personally, I believe because of that power, it is down to us to sort of like educate the other youth who don't know why certain things are being done. Because like sometimes you decide to do something and people, you just find they sit back comfortably, and it's not because they don't want to do something, but it's because they just sort of like, they have fear or they don't care. But when they see somebody else that they look up to who's a youth do it, then they'll try and back you up on that. So we have the internet, which is one of the fastest thing right now, where like Twitter, for example, Twitter is a big place that a lot of people go out there and just sort of like make a huge movement. And once they all are coming into agreement, everybody will come and join. And then another thing I have found as well, like aside what my fellow panelists have said, is I think more times as well, you come to find youth who are like, they don't really care, like they're okay being where they're at, and even if they see something wrong with something, just because they're comfortable with that, it doesn't really personally affect their sort of like personal life. They don't want to like make any movements towards it or try and make a change or stand for something. So to me, I think it's a problem. But to looking at how we can sort of like, obviously how the youth can bring a change, I think right now, given this generation that we're in, the youth are doing great. And if you go to a lot of places, you see a lot of young people in different organizations who are in playing as heads of organizations. And it's not where you get to see the elder people again, but now you get to see young people going out there. And I think also some of the elderly people, they have to be willing and accepting to let the young people take over. Some people don't want to like let go. So you can also be in a position to, as a youth, to sort of like make a movement or like lead something. So personally, in terms of planet repairs and stuff like that, one, I believe if we are doing this, then we need to educate a lot of young people out there, because some just don't care, or they're just okay with what they are doing right now in terms of life, and also a lot want to do something, but they're not sure what to do. So a few months ago in Bristol, just before we went on lockdown, there's a girl who came from one of the European countries. I forgot her name. She's a teenager, so like, and she came all the way from Bristol, and she just did a huge movement in Bristol, in one of the biggest town centers, and she attracted a lot of people from different countries, and they came down to Bristol, and there was so much traffic for a whole week. I forgot her name. She was just, yes, Greta, that's the name. And when she did that, like, at first you saw the signs in town when you're driving around, like, why are people stopping you from going to work? And you're kind of like angry. But then when you go back to sort of like read about her and why she did what she did, as young as she is, I was really proud of her for her to be able to make that bold statement and then move with it. So, but compared to other people her age, not everybody knew why she's doing what she's doing, and they didn't even know why the climate, or why there's, or they don't even know anything to do with climate change or planet repairs, nothing like that. So for her to do that, I was really proud, and I feel like if maybe 100 of her type, or like more youth get to know this, then we can take things into our own hands and sort of like make a movement with it. So personally, I feel like the youth are in a big position where we can sort of like rise up to the challenge and also tackle some of these things.
Kofi? what is your position on what the role of the youth is?
You started off by quoting one of our greatest Pan-African guerrilla intellectual scholar activist, Frantz Fanon, on what each generation must do. And the Pan-African movement takes its inspiration and guidance on the question of the role of youth in struggle from those kinds of wisdom that there is in the treasure house of Pan-African knowledge, which is a very powerful one, which has been actually shaped very much by the intellectual wealth, not only of our own indigenous community knowledges, but also by what young people have been able to contribute. And actually, most of our Pan-African leaders have actually started their activism from very youthful ages. I got into Pan-African activism in my teenage years, having started, youth activism even much earlier. But, Pan-African thought and action has been shaped very much by young people who, even before Frantz Fanon put it that succinctly, knew what their role was as far as their community responsibilities were. And this is because traditional African society, with its indigenous system of education, paid great attention to teaching young people what their role ought to be. And so the rites of passage way of training young people, both boys and girls, is critical to making young people aware of what their role is to the community, what their rights and responsibilities are to the community. And in a certain sense, the African communities that we have mainly have seen the role of young people as that of scouts. In fact, Baden-Powell, who started the Boy Scouts movement, and that later on came to include the Girl Guides, took the example from studying how youth were prepared for their community roles in Africa, where he went as part of the colonial army of British imperialist invasion, of the continent. Those are some of the things he learned from there and brought back, into here, and then packaged it, and it's not credited, to the African people, in what the British call their colony of the Gold Coast, which is now Ghana, but it's seen as a British invention. Okay, so these are some of the issues about coloniality that demand decolonization that we need to deal with. But that's fundamentally how traditional African society has seen the role of its youth. Scouts, people who advance, who rooted in their community knowledge with a huge sense of responsibility to their community, and under the guidance of elders, go forward, try to be pathfinders in terms of where further their society should move on. So the role of progress in society, the pathfinders of progress in traditional African society, are actually young people. And the Pan-African movement has tried to learn from that and revive that. And that is why it saw young people when in its formulation in the diaspora with the 1900 conference here in London, which was convened by Henry Sylvester Williams and others who were mainly students at the time, in 1900, they saw themselves as having to play these roles. And that is how knowledge from the continent of Africa, gathered by even Africans, were forcibly torn from their homelands, and into chattel enslavement, with the Mangamese phase of chattel enslavement, held on to that knowledge, passed it on to their offspring, and this informed the emergence, the revival of the Pan-African movement, when it held that first international conference, formulated itself formally in 1900 here in London, Britain. Now, listening to Sanyaolu and all the others young people who have spoken, I'm immensely proud that our African youth, both on the continent and in the diaspora, have not stopped trying to make that effort of fighting injustice wherever they are. And Pan-Africanism fundamentally is that of building African unity across the world to confront the injustices that African people face, like Afrophobia that sets the mindset for the genocide and ecocide that has been perpetrated against African communities wherever they are, at home and abroad. And therefore, when the Pan-African movement, particularly under its, again, youthful leaders like Marcus Garvey, raised the slogan of Africa for Africans, they meant precisely that African youth, as part of their communities of resistance across the world, would unify to fight against every injustice and reclaim African sovereignty and control over wealth, so that the foreign plunder of African wealth and destruction of African people and its environment, which we now see as ecocide, will stop. So the question of the role of youth in fighting planet repairs has long been understood as one of building power to counteract the profit-making enterprise of a few who seek to destroy the planet in order to make profit from the business of killing not just human beings and all life forms, but deliberately killing the planet. That is what they make their profit-making business. So African people, from ever since they were confronted by European colonization in the form of white supremacist racism that grew into what we recognize as global apartheid racism, have made it an essential part of their environmental battles, an essential part of their liberation struggles, both on the continent and diaspora, has always been the fight for environmental justice. And so when people make the mistaken statement that the climate justice movement is only white, right? They forget that for African people and for the majority of humanity in terms of indigenous communities, particularly of the global south in the majority world, they cannot afford the luxury of separating the environmental justice struggle from their own emancipation struggles, right? And that has been the contribution. There's no generation of African people, of global south people, who have not met, reclaiming a more harmonious relationship with nature with Mother Earth, part of their struggles for emancipation. You know, so those people don't have the luxury of separating environmentalism from the totality of their liberation struggle. So these are some of the things that have to be learned. I just want to run up with this, that Osagyefo Kwame Nkrumah, one of the giants of Pan-Africanism, put it this way: youth must be the spark of the revolution. And so that is really what young people have to do. And within the Pan-African context, you see, when people like Henry Sylvester Williams, Du Bois, and others met in London in 1900 to formally revive the movement for African unity that started on the continent of Africa, and to try and constitute a global movement for Pan-Africanism, what they were consciously aware of was that the fighting in different parts of the world, African people fighting, you know, isolated battles against injustice in different parts of the world, was not going to lead them to win any major victory against a globally organized system of white supremacist racism that, you know, European imperialism had become. And they needed to unify their efforts. And my hope is that today's youth will build on that recognition, which, of course, there are movements like the Moja Africa Youth and Student Movement for African Unity, that's part of the XR Affinity All African, you know, network, you know, that are trying to do this. But it's important that African youth and student groups build unity amongst themselves and do what their predecessors have done, so that their fight is globally coordinated in order to be part of the fight for global justice. And that is how the Pan-African movement, when, you know, it met in 1900 and started formally, you know, programming its resistance that led to the kind of nominal independence we have in Africa today. That's the thinking, and I hope that that thinking will inform what young people are doing across the world. And I'm glad that through the voices of Sanyalo and the others who've spoken, particularly those in Extinction Rebellion, would hear what, as XRISN, we have long been saying. The rebellion did not begin with Extinction Rebellion, right? Our rebellion, particularly in the Global South, is intergenerational from time immemorial, and we welcome the rebels in Extinction Rebellion to join in this.
Funding is a major concern in South Africa, because many South African youth rely on the assistance to get to like climate strikes, protests, and meetings. And they may not have the funds for transport to get there themselves. And this directly links with poverty, which isn't just a big thing in South Africa, in third world countries. Obviously, there's quite a lot of poverty there as well. And this can be a major barrier towards activism, as one rather focuses on how to get through the day than what will happen in the future. And it's really, really difficult, I guess, to focus on the future when you're struggling in the present. So in that way, a lot of youth are automatically just kind of cut out, and they don't necessarily, like, they don't have time to, you know, become or be an activist. So in a way to like kind of fix this, I guess, continuous support such as transport to and from like meetings, strikes, and activities is a really good way to start and get more people to engage in climate activism. But South Africa, just like many other countries, is in lockdown at the moment due to the coronavirus. And the African Climate Alliance, the organization that I'm a part of, has moved its meetings online. But this also automatically cuts out many ACA members, as they may not have access to data, cell phones, good connection. So then how are they supposed to kind of be involved in meetings and climate proceedings online? We do try our best, though, to include those who don't have data by providing, but even then sometimes it's not enough. By developing workshops and educating people is the best way to empower people, because without education, how can you take action? Giving opportunities to all youth that allow them to free their activist voices is important too.
A lot of people do not have the privilege to separate the fight for, you know, the environment and social justice, which is like, yeah, you touched on. I guess, Amy, because since I've just asked you a bit more, how do you feel we could, you know, bring these two things together?
Social justice and climate justice are very closely linked. Climate justice kind of depends on your social situation. So like I said, if you're kind of poorer and have less money and stuff like that, I guess it's harder to kind of focus on activism. Whereas if you're middle income to high income, you ultimately have more money, and I don't know, climate change will kind of affect you less in a way. Because you can't buy yourself out of climate change. It will happen to everyone, but you can definitely put in measures that will protect you more than someone with less money can. And in that way, you're automatically connecting social and climate justice. I think it's important to just always make the marginalized feel more empowered and to kind of bring them up a step, because ultimately it will be harder for them to kind of start at the bottom and build their way up when middle income people are automatically given a stool and are just kind of able to, I don't know, get more involved with things more easily, I guess. But yeah.
Do you have like any lessons, you know, that you could tell us, any things that you've learned from your experience so far that you think some of like the young people and also adults watching this could learn from, and just to share any of those like key learnings?
I'd say full open-mindedness is a good way to go. Like when you go into meetings or when you meet new people, I think sometimes we automatically kind of become judgmental in a way. Like you might not necessarily agree with what someone has said, and then kind of choose to tune that out and whatnot. And I think it's very important to listen to what everyone has to say, because ultimately that, like what they've said, will definitely make a difference and contribute to like how you kind of look at the world as a whole. What else, I guess? Well, I mean, what I've loved about climate striking and protesting is the fact that I've been able to meet so many people that I probably would have never met if it wasn't for protesting and stuff, because I think climate justice brings so many people together, as it is such a big thing and a lot of people want to get involved. And it's definitely like I've made friends for life, I think, who I can always have really nice conversations with about issues such as these.
Thank you. So yeah, just going back to like the second question I had for you guys that I asked Amy at the beginning is like, how do you feel how can we engage more young people, and like what are the barriers?
How we can engage our young people is basically let's just there's so many ways and methods, and obviously by word of mouth, and sometimes as well like letting people understand what it is that you are, you know, like making a movement for, because more times we want people to understand what we're doing, but we can't really explain to them what it is that we are actually making a stand for. So if we could actually educate them, so education is one for me. We need to educate our fellow young people, our fellow youth, our friends on some of the things on climate change and why it's so important. And another thing is basically just wherever we find ourselves in our communities and stuff like that, we need to use the internet to share a lot, and also try and get friends to just come in and supporting what we're doing, and making them understand why it is so important to why climate change is so important as well in our communities, and obviously not just our communities but the rest of the world as well. Because, for example, I had to go to Ghana in, last Christmas, and I think it rained, and normally there's the rainy season, so it rained heavily where I was at, and on the way to visiting my grandma, it's just the landscape and how it got, there's so much erosion of the water, so much that is flooded the road and it's made huge poles, and you see the neighborhood and the community coming out, and they are just talking and blaming the government in doing so. But I think sometimes they blame, but more time, by why they blame, they don't know why they're blaming, and they can't really sort of like get somebody to be a spokesperson for them to take their situation to maybe the government or someone who can help them. But because of this, like, the youth who were there as well, they just left it for the elderly people, and you get the older guys who are obviously old in wisdom and a lot of things, but physically they are not active like that. The youth are just there, and sometimes I feel like until we get them to understand what is really going on in the world, to get them to be getting active, they are always going to see. A lot of people think that they don't, like, climate change is not important for them because it might not be personally affecting them, their own lifestyles, but it does affect us as a whole, as a collective. So I feel like education is really important. And also, I never really used to get anything like that, but I signed up for one thing, and ever since then I used to be getting this emails sent through all the time, like climate change, and they're talking about this and that. Do you want to be interested? So at first I thought, like, why are you sending me this? I don't really care about it because that's not where I like to thrive and stuff like that. So, but I realized the more I looked at things, and as a whole, that our planet is being impacted, and it's been affected a lot. And if you talk more, for example, the polar ice caps, they say that it's soon to be melting, and these are some of the things that affect the planet as a whole. So for me, education is a big one for me, and we need to obviously invite our friends when we do movements like that. Invite friends, even if they're gonna come or not, just invite them anyway. And there's too many people as well. So
thank you for joining us. Any last thing that you'd like to say to any other young people who might be watching this?
We need to stop being afraid, and we need to also take risk and be bold and just approach the authorities, the elderly, the people who are in charge, and just let them know what you can also do. Let them know that you have the power. Because, like, in this generation, there is so much that we know as young people. There's so much we know that we can also teach and learn from the elderly and then the older guys who've gone before us. And sometimes, I know from an African perspective, it's hard trying to talk to the elderly because more time they don't want to really be willing to listen to you, and they feel like maybe they know it all. And sometimes we also feel like, you know what, we just leave it. But I have also learned to be bold sometimes and just go out and say it and try and get their attention and explain it to them in a way that it don't appear to be rude or to be too, like, because we need to understand certain cultures and certain tradition and certain things. So from where I was brought up, like, you can't just go out there and say anything to somebody who's older than you, even if it's by a year or a week or a few seconds. They're older than you. You have to always respect them. And for the youth out there, we need to take it serious, and we need to also understand that we cannot say we live in this part of the world, so I don't really care what's happening on the other side. The whole planet is a collective thing for everybody else. And for me, if anyone know about Greta, we should also learn from her, because as young as she is, she made a very bold statement, and I feel like it stood. So for the young people watching us, I would like for us to obviously take initiative and go out there and just get things done as well.
Someone, Jendai, thank you for posting that in the chat. It just, for people who can't see it, it's part of the problem in the UK is that many youth are comfortable and seduced by materialism. Many have parents who are not conscientized to their reality and are focused on everyday survival, no long-term thinking or planning, no sense of collectivism beyond attending events, including funerals. And I relate so much to this comment here. I just want to say that the like intergenerational trauma that's there from like assimilation and all of this on this side of the world really plays a part in whether youth in the diaspora actually get involved in these struggles, whether they feel like it's safe for them to do so, they can practically do so, and they're they're going to be allowed to do so by their parents, because we need to stop telling our children to focus on their education and focus on getting a good job and becoming a doctor or a lawyer, because there's more than that. And I know that, for example, if I had just chosen to listen to my parents doing that, then I wouldn't have gotten involved in some of the most like fulfilling fights that I've gotten involved in. And in a way, it just cuts all of the work before us. It cuts all of the work out that's like before our parents has been done to get them to where they are, when we just choose to kind of take the abuse that we're dealt with when we're on this side of the world, and everywhere really. But I think that the socioeconomic factors are really important as well. So Amy touched on it about young people who just don't have the finances, not getting involved. And I think that is a big part of it, but I don't think that, I think that we have to kind of meet so movements that are already there, so diaspora movements that are already there, kind of have to also meet young people where they're at. So for example, if we're being seduced by materialism, we've got to explain some of the roots of why that's come from. Talk about even just within the music industry, how that has been used to pit Black people against each other instead of allowing us to actually get involved in the things that would guarantee our safety. I think that you kind of at the intersection of where those things are, where people are they're worried about like, oh, my finances, or that I'm not going to have status, things like that. We kind of have to talk to them and explain, like ask them why those are their priorities. I know that it's difficult for as a young person speaking to other young people about some of these issues. They kind of just say, oh, I don't engage with politics. And it's difficult. I'm not speaking about youth in general. I'm talking about, Black youth and youth of color in general. It almost feels like sometimes it's a choice to not engage with activism because, it's just going to be less hassle. And it is difficult. It is challenging trying to be taken seriously in, a system that's very like colonialized and like a lot of issues with like the European white, very middle class environmental movement.
I agree with other speakers who majored on education as a major factor militating against participation of young people, in climate change struggles or struggles even generally. Because, how do you tell someone who is not educated? When I mean educated now, I meant both whether formal or informal. How do you explain to them that the implications of climate change? He wouldn't even be concerned about the possibility of death by climate change. Most of them are concerned about the immediate needs. I don't have a job. I'm hungry. So you're telling me climate change is going to kill me next year, next 10 years, next 15 years. I may not even witness the time when ecocide will become a total disaster. But forgetting the fact that every day the disaster happens and every day we get closer to the major disaster, but you won't blame them. But also there's still a problem too with even the so-called educated people, whether young or old, or whether you got a formal education or informal education. The question is even that what kind of education are they even teaching in our schools? I remember there is this song I love a lot. It was by Peter Tosh. where it was saying you can't blame the youth, you can't fool the youth. You are teaching the youth to learn in school that the cow jump over the moon. You're teaching the youth to learn in school that the dish run away with the spoon. You're teaching the youth to learn in school that Christopher Columbus, you said he was a very great man. You talked about Marco Polo. You said Marco Polo was a very great man. And I said, what were these great, so-called great men doing? They were killing, stealing, kidnapping, raping. So what Peter Tosh was trying to say eventually is that our society, the kind of music that our society, its culture, even the kind of education it passes through, makes crime looks very attractive. And it's not any kind of crime. It's a kind of crime that puts an entire nation, makes an entire nation the poverty capital of the world. You understand? There's a crime of stealing trillions in dollars. And then about these kind of persons who are the major crime stars. You understand? They are the people that are made leaders of our churches. They are the people who are made leaders. In fact, we dignify them with chieftaincy titles these days. So tell me, but meanwhile, the people who are saying the truth, who are standing by firm principles, there is this local language that we used to. I mean, my local language. Now, I'm permitted to use a local language. I will interpret it in English. He said we used to say in my in my language that that is, the truthful person does not have a property. That is, when you are truthful, you are likely not to have a property. In fact, a truthful person is will be abandoned by the society. That is the meaning of that statement. So that with that kind of informal education from society, you understand, nobody wants to be truthful. Everybody wants to be a thief. Nobody wants to be an activist. You understand? Nobody wants to be an activist. You are looking forward to being some sort of big politician that loots. So I think our society is much more complicit in this. So those are the two conditions: the problem of lack of education and the problem of the kind of education that is dished out. For instance, in Nigeria, if young people, probably of my generation, had been fed with proper history in high school, they wouldn't have voted the current president, who is now charging all of us for treasonable felony, for leading a protest. Because it's quite crazy, because the current president of Nigeria was military head of state in 1983, between 1983 to 1985. And it became a military head of state by staging a coup against a democratically elected government. And as military head of state, he attacked young people. He killed young people. He killed education, killed future, killed a lot of things that is killable. Every good thing that shows what he kills it. So if probably our history books are taught about that man, you get young people who grew up to voting age would not have considered voting all over again in 2015 as president of the country. So I think the whole lot of, that's one condition. The problem of lack of education and the problem of lack of quality education, you understand, are a major factor. And I think that in addition to the earlier point, I made the point of social condition. I think other speakers made that point too, militating against young people. You understand? So I think it would be very difficult mobilizing young people without at least raising social questions of access to basic education, because young people are concerned about getting access to education. So you have to raise that question. Young people are immediately concerned about the problem of unemployment that leads to mind-boggling poverty. You need to raise that question. So it is in raising this question, can we build a coalition of young people you link up, we'll be able to link up the town and the town and the gowns in the university. You link up the students in tertiary institutions with young people in the communities by aligning their interests and eventually making them strike a major enemy, that is the enemies of our planet. So, and there is no gainsaying that young people are already organizing independently. I mean, the proof of it is that we are all here, we are young people. Alejandra, I know you do a whole lot of things. In fact, you are almost, I don't know the number of meetings you attend. And there is Steph here who does a lot too. She is a student leader in the university. You understand? Amy is not here. She's doing a lot. But I think, so, but there's a major problem of coordination. Young people we all need to coordinate ourselves and then strike collectively. If there is any lesson we can learn from the young people in high school, led by, initiated by Greta Thunberg, is that they coordinated a global strike. I don't think, like I said earlier, the International Labour Union had never done that before. Probably I'm not aware. But at the last time I checked, despite the results, they haven't done that. So I think young people we do have a lot of potential initiative. We can tap into high energy, and they just have to be that organization or coalition of organizations, which by the way is a subjective factor that helps to pull young people together towards a common cause.
Just touching on what Juwon said, you know, we're being concerned with the immediate conditions rather than the long term. I think this is an issue within climate movement in general. So where my university is in East London, it's like predominantly like a Bangladeshi Bengali community, and when we striked there, they didn't know about the things that were going on back home as well as here in and so when the link was made between what's going on back home in the motherland and how the government is actually complicit in that, is made aware to the youth, it makes such a difference, because when they realize how interconnected things are, it really, or at least I've seen that's one of the main things that causes people to kind of stick around in a movement, because they realize just how, like, even them calling attention to those things can make a difference. For example, okay, I'm not going into an example, you don't have time, but I just wanted to say that I think a lot of the other side of engagement is, so in the UK, recently we had, like, when we had the last general election, it was like a very progressive youth vote, okay, and then obviously the Labour Party here in the UK didn't win that election. But then it's like, where has that voice gone of the youth to actually get involved more? Okay, they're on the street striking along with the school children, and then where's our representation in that? Not even representation. Why are we not then engaging more so with that? And I think the appeal of, like, socialist politics in that election was really important, because I think young people aren't stupid. Young people have access to more resources than they've ever had, and I think speaking to them so they don't understand that obviously is highly insulting. But when we kind of explain the way that capitalism and the climate crisis are so linked, that, like, it makes such a difference, especially with younger than myself or university students. But when you point that out, and then they recognize how you can actually fight for socioeconomic as well as like climate struggles at the same time, that is yeah, I think that's a really big part. I think we shouldn't shy away from linking those two things, because so for example, I mean, just over this coronavirus crisis alone, I know Juwon's in Nigeria. I have family there too. I've been keeping up a little bit of what's going on, but just like the amount of money, the billions that are just sitting there in oil reserves, because, you know, many countries were told that you need to have real-term capital, you need to stop investing in things, you need this real capital in terms of oil. And then now what are we doing? We're borrowing from the IMF again. And seeing those links between how, you know, fossil fuel industries completely infiltrate our governments and our decision making in countries, I think is really eye-opening, and can explaining, not dumbing it down, can really help to explain that to young people so that they feel empowered to get involved and to feel like they can actually call attention to that, because then they know something that you know, the other people in their classroom in school don't really understand, and that this is a bigger picture, making them feel part of this global picture of liberating it. Because, you know, we say, okay, why is it that, like, I can't remember the exact figure, but I think the liberation of like some African nations was at the same time as like a lot of Southeast Asian countries. I can't remember the dates off the top of my head, I'm sorry, but why is it that our liberation has taken the longest of all? And I think talking about that, someone's also just said something that's really important. I'm getting distracted, but basically just really, really quickly, is the problem part of the overall ongoing lack of pride in our identity? This is just, I'm going to finish on this, I promise.
Don't worry, don't worry.
We have a big problem, especially within like Afro-Caribbean, when you have like this sort of dual nationality sort of mentality, people, because of the way that like microaggressions happen in like global north, you are kind of, and this Afrophobia that I wanted to speak about is just that we're told to value the like Caribbean side of our identity more, constantly reinforcing that in media. And you know, even just there's lots and lots, the colorism of it of course is one side of it, but then it constantly reinforces that idea that it's something to be ashamed of. Our African heritage is something to be ashamed of. That's all that people hear when they hear that country's name over here on this side of the world is poverty. And then those things can have an impact on young person's empowerment and feeling like they can fight for something that is constantly being dismissed in their reality every day of their lives.
The young people who've spoken before me all have made extremely very important, brilliant points in terms of how do you engage more young people and what are the barriers. And clearly, I would say it's summed up, you know, by Steph, you know, in terms of Afrophobic racism, which is the way not just Europe as a white global power, but its puppets that now, you know, mostly run Africa, you know, impose on the African people both at home, you know, and abroad. And that is why the focus of Pan-Africanism is on challenging the racism of Afrophobia. And without supporting our young people in their everyday resistance to Afrophobic racism, which is institutionalized as part of, you know, not just white supremacist racism in Britain, but also global apartheid racism, we're not going to get more young people, particularly from African heritage and global South, you know, non-white communities, you know, building the kind of alliances, or very comfortable in building the kind of alliances that would increase the strength of the movements fighting for planet repairs. And that is why we must understand the necessity to combat Afrophobia and other forms of anti-Black racism, and also the colorism, you know, whereby, you know, the lighter, you know, the shade of your skin, you know, the more you are, you know, brought closer to white privilege, you know, and it is that battle particularly at this time, that the greatest concern of non-white peoples on the planet today is the real threat now of the weaponization of pandemics to wipe out the rest of the population in other as an eco-fascist response to the climate and ecological crisis. The way then to deal with that is to go back to the issues of power, because so long as the white minority in the world continues to wield utmost power and subjects the majority of the peoples of the world to powerlessness through reactionary violence, because the only way they maintain that power is through violence against everybody else, right? Racist violence, global apartheid, racist violence. So the challenge is really that. But to what extent, and this is the question that people like Sejalo have posed, to what extent is the educational system, even in the countries of the global, teaching people about the realities of the world, the abuse of power that there is in the world today? And that is why the decolonization of education has become an important struggle for young people across the world, to be able to know the truth, right? And this is where the youth needs the greatest support, because so long as we keep imposing upon the youth the big lies of colonial education and trying to hold up these institutions, which are actually sites of crime, of the crime of menticide, the killing of minds. This is what schools, colleges, and universities organize, within the system of white supremacy. This is what they represent. They are spaces for killing the minds of young people. And that is why the way youth can organize themselves today and strengthen their combative power is unifying across the world to challenge the racism that is the menticide, that is part of the genocide, that itself is part of the ecocide we're talking about. And it is in this sense that, for example, the kind of knowledges that pan-africanism brings to the fight for planet repairs, the kind of knowledges that indigenous communities bring from their own indigenous treasure houses of knowledge to this fight, to ensure that we conduct we build a movement of movements with the pluriversality of these knowledges, with respect for intersectionality, that this is not done by imposing against Eurocentrism and its coloniality through neocolonialism upon young people, that the battle to democratize properly educational institutions and involve young people in building people's assemblies, right? And these people's assemblies, develop from the grassroots into global citizens' assemblies, where young people everywhere have a right to good quality global citizenship education from their own indigenous communities' perspective. These are the actual challenges, of today. And this is why when there are, and we have to be very frank, right? That within the climate, the environmental movement, there are forces of eco-fascism that are intent on imposing white supremacy, racist Eurocentrism as the only worldview of this movement, right? And when we, for example, through the Extinction Rebellion International Solidarity Network, are encouraging pluriversality within and around XR as the key to true conscientization that leads to building a genuine movement or movements, we are seeing resistance to that within and around Extinction Rebellion. Today, XRISN is a target of a white supremacy racist conspiracy to liquidate us from even within XR. And all kinds of shenanigans are being played out. And I'm saying that even if those who are paying hypocritical lip service to planet repairs, to changing the world, to addressing the climate and ecological crisis, are still so steeped in a white fragility of racism, to the extent that they see SRISN's work as a threat. SRI's work of genuine international solidarity that amplifies voices like what we're hearing, voices like that of Sanyaolu, who without this event would not sound to the majority of people within XR, let alone the wider climate movement. This is the kind of work that XRISN has been trying to do to challenge the Eurocentrism that is imposed upon the environmental movement by its white supremacy racist circles. If we do not rally to promote this work, then there will be barriers. Barriers not just to youth from African heritage communities that need to come into the movement and with African knowledge in order to inculcate that into global citizenship education by youth from all non-white communities of the global south and even of the global north, in terms of the indigenous people oppressed in Abiyala, for example, right? If we don't open up this movement to, for fighting to win planet repairs, if it's not open up to all knowledges, all perspectives of plurality, if we don't decolonize the knowledge so far, the white controls of the environmental movement are trying to be the worldview of all of us, then barriers will be set. And these barriers are not only against global South youth, but against, in fact, youth racialized as white, because they are denied the knowledges that our global South communities of resistance have been producing for centuries in our own resistance to Eurocentric coloniality, right? But if we are to work together in harmony and build a kind of cross-community solidarity that is the only one that will deliver victory to, to us, then it means that the foremost thing we should all be uniting to fight in is racism.
Really allowing us to be proud of who we are and who we are as a people collectively, is education in terms of us speaking to one another. That generational gap needs to be bridged, because that trauma doesn't heal without the talking taking place. I know that sounds very spiritual, but it's I think, like, for me personally, it's one of the things that I've struggled with, wanting to engage more with. So this whole, the way I would probably try to phrase it is, obviously talking is one part of it, and that's within, like, that's not just within your families. I mean, within whatever resistance groups you're part of, being able to have those discussions, not feeling like that person is untouchable. And I know it's very difficult, especially with African culture, where we do pride ourselves on respect. It is some respect of our elders, and we recognize the knowledge that they have, but it's become very much of a formality in terms of, you bow at this point, you do this now, there, but it doesn't value that communication stream as much. And I think there's many reasons why, but I think it's really important to address that sort of elephant in the room, because it is a barrier for that knowledge being passed down effectively and with pride.
Kofi had done a lot to give explanations as regards what needed to be done. And in a way, it took me back to my personal experience again, which I'll just share in less than 2 minutes. It's more or less, when I, as a freshman in the university, when I recently gained admission into the university, I did not particularly take interest in activism. So let's just say by mere leap of, it was just accidental. Anyway, I attended a program, more a public symposium organized by the student union of my university, and they had to bring old kidders in the struggle, more experienced kidders in the struggle to come speak with us students. And it was in that program that I got baptized with the waters of radical ideas flowing from more experienced, people, older people in the struggle who had come to motivate our interest in the struggle. And all through my years as a student leader, I faced 6, actually I remember I have all letters, I faced 6 disciplinary panels, sent out of university twice, was sent to prison more times than I can remember. But in all of these challenges, there was something that was quite unique. It is the support of old people willing to give us free legal services. I don't have money to get a lawyer, but the old people made sure we had lawyers so that we can. So with the assurance that there was a lawyer who was willing to defend me in court, I could do and undo. I had the courage to articulate my point without fear, knowing fully well that I will come out of it. Long and short is that if there was no such support, if the older generation had not come to my university to come to talk to us, I wouldn't have become an activist. And if we never had the privilege of this older generation still standing with us, providing us with all support, we would have gotten frustrated out of the struggle.
It's quite a huge blessing to have the likes of Juwon on this program, and also Steph. Because in my own particular case, entering into activism before I was even 10 years old, it took the older generation, including my parents and grandparents, who made sure I learned our indigenous Beto community values and the traditions of resistance, passed on from one generation to the other, but also, people who I got to meet on the road of activism, who supported me throughout. I lost my father quite early, but it is that support of older generations of activists who literally, did everything to ensure that my activism was well supported. That has kept me on this road. And this is why I feel very much a responsibility towards younger generations in the very same way. That's how I was taught, and I was taught that it becomes an obligation for the older generations always to be there for young people, not just in terms of, advice and guidance on what is good, but also to be honest in terms of truth-telling example. So we share the challenges from our successes as well as failures, honestly, with the younger generation, and encourage them to do better. Where we failed, they ought to do better, right? And where we succeeded, they have to have greater successes than ours. That is the scouting role of youth that within, indigenous African knowledge, is planted, in young people and taught through the true rites of passages, ceremonies. And also, this is important in terms of what Amilcar Cabral said, claim no easy victories, tell no lies. You cannot make young people believe that the road of activism is a bed of roses, right? And that there will be quick fixes. You know, they must be well educated and trained to also be able to creatively meet the challenges of their lives, you know, and not let adversity, you know, dissuade them, you know, from, you know, what Angela Davis calls staying power. You know, you have to endure in resistance and pass it on, you know, to the other generation. But it also means that that call for truth telling also means that we have to be honest about the challenges that we face. So when it is racism, you call it racism, you know, of Afrophobia, and don't run away from it. You know, sometimes people peddle this in about, oh, what, no naming or shaming, you know, right? Some of these things are very difficult within the conditions of resistance of our communities in the global south, because if you have no clear, you know, a view of who the enemies are and who your true friends are, you know, how are you going to progress? And it is the duty of the older generation from their own experiences to educate properly and honestly the younger generation to know what activism entails. Because even in this country, I've seen many people who walk in and walk out of resistance, who don't have staying power, who cannot develop the discipline of protracted struggle, you know, and those are some of the things that we owe the young people. But most important, to support the likes of Juwon, you know, and Steph, so that their voices and examples reach each other across the world. There's nothing more powerful that changes the world than youth fighting, not in isolation from each other, but youth fighting in a way that they are globally connected. This is what pan-afrikanism seeks to do with youth of African descent, but also to instill in them that it is also their responsibility, their internationally solidarity responsibility, to reach out to young people and other communities of resistance like themselves across the world, because that is the only way we can win the kind of victory that we in Pan-African lexicon will give us not only Mat Ubuntu Man, but also Ubuntu Dunia of planet repairs. That is to say, stop the Mangamizi, build Mat Ubuntu Dunia in, build Mat Ubuntu Man in Ubuntu. This is what we mean, you know. So our work in alliance with Extinction Rebellion is to develop true allies that will not deflect us from our Pan-African liberation struggle, but be able to unify our forces across the world for global justice. And that is what Pan-African internationalism means. And the intergenerational dialogue is critical for this to succeed.
Also, would ask the question, already gave an example of one of the ways with which young people can be reached. Through the social media, through organizing games. I could ever remember that before the lockdown, my movement, the harm I did in the movement, the campus wing, we were planning a campus musical tour where we take music from campus to campus, but majorly political music. Artists who sing music pertaining to social consciousness. So with such method, those are one of young people are attracted to music ordinarily. So through music and entertainment, I think we can also reach out to young people. So generally speaking, in reaching young people, we need to be very, very artistic in our approach. And gaming, music, and Twitter, social media are one of those ways. Yeah.
I very much agree with Juwon. Like music, especially, I know so many people, now it's become more mainstream that more like politically music is being heard by the youth, but it's still like a very good way to discern people who are interested in that sort of resistance, but maybe don't want to get fully involved. So then they hear the music for a bit, and this is like a spiritual connection with the teachings of before when you play them that music. So I love that that idea. But basically, I think one of the other ways that might be a good idea is obviously we use social media a lot, but I think if the young people are brought into, are aware of the ways in which racism even pervades within technology and within like big data, making people aware of those sorts of things as well, like within gaming sectors. I know, for example, they've now created, I don't remember who, but it was a game in which you're a refugee fleeing war-torn land. And obviously that was not like an African initiative, but things like this that kind of spotlight our struggles can then engage people across another side of the world who may not necessarily be keen to get involved with through the normal channels of engaging with activism, protesting, etc., and are disillusioned with that. They can maybe gain some insight through those sort of games. Yeah, I think it's a possible way. But social media, I think, is quite a big tool that is being used more and more. But you know, I mean, even Juwon, I hope you're okay with me saying this, but even seeing how us sending in a video for the pots and pan protest in Nigeria over the palliative care made an impact, and some people were completely blown away by that. The fact that just sending in a video was able to make such a difference in in the everyday lives of Nigerians. And I think that showing how, like, giving them those examples and, you know, showing them that activism doesn't have to be the way that you think it is, and the way that you've been told it is. You can just make it whatever it meets you where you're at, basically. So.
And just one, thank you so much again for African Voices Forum and the XRISN, the XR Bristol, for putting this together, but especially to African Voices Forum and to all of our panelists for being here today. Thank you very much.